The accusation came before Nora had even taken off her coat. Harold stood behind the counter with the cash drawer open, his face red. The morning receipts spread across the counter like evidence at a trial. $40 short, he said, and he said it 3 times before Nora managed to say a single word back. The diner was already full. Truckers and morning regulars looked up from their coffee, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Nora felt every eye in the room land on her at once, but she kept her voice steady. "I didn't touch the drawer yesterday, Harold. I was on tables the whole shift." Then explain the number. She could have explained it. The answer was sitting in a notebook at her apartment, 3 weeks of small mismatches she had quietly tracked, because numbers were the one thing in her life that always made sense. She knew exactly where that $40 had gone, and it had nothing to do with her apron pocket. It had gone into Kyle's pocket, the same way small amounts had been disappearing since the week he started working the register. She opened her mouth to say his name. Harold didn't give her the chance. "I want your apron off and your name off the schedule, today." A woman 2 booths down lowered her newspaper to watch. A trucker near the door set his mug down without drinking from it. Nora untied her apron with hands that did not shake, folded it once, and placed it on the counter the way she might set down a napkin after a meal she had finished and paid for. "You're firing the wrong person," she said. Harold's jaw tightened. "I'm firing the person standing in front of me." There was nothing else to say to a man who had already decided the story before he asked the first question. Nora picked up her bag from behind the counter, walked past the register where Kyle was suddenly very interested in restocking sugar packets, and pushed through the front door into the cold. She did not cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not give people the satisfaction of watching her fall apart, especially people who had never once had to wonder where their next paycheck was coming from. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk and breathed, counting the seconds the way she counted everything else, until the shaking in her chest settled into something colder and more useful. The door opened behind her. Maggie came out still wearing her apron, glancing back over her shoulder like she'd snuck away from a hostage situation. "He's an idiot," Maggie said. "Everyone in that kitchen knows it's Kyle. Everyone. Then why does nobody say anything?" Maggie's mouth twisted. "Because Kyle is dating Harold's daughter, and saying it out loud means losing your job for telling the truth, instead of for nothing at all. At least this way you get unemployment." It was not comforting, but it was honest, and honesty had become rare enough in Nora's life that she appreciated it even when it stung. Maggie pressed a folded 20 into her hand before she could protest, told her to call when she found something, and disappeared back inside before Harold noticed she was gone. Nora stood alone on the sidewalk a moment longer, looking at the diner sign through the window, the grease-stained menu taped beside the door, the life she had just lost over $40 she had never touched. 2 weeks of wages, gone. 6 months of quietly noticing things nobody else bothered to notice, gone with them. She had always been like this, even as a child. While other kids forgot where they put their shoes, Nora remembered the exact total of her mother's grocery bill from 3 stores ago. She remembered phone numbers after hearing them once, remembered which till drawer was short by exactly how much on which day, remembered faces and the small tells that came before someone lied. It was not a gift anyone had ever paid her for. It was simply the way her mind worked, sorting and filing while everyone around her moved through the world half a step behind their own thoughts. She walked home because she could not afford the bus, the cold air doing what it always did, sharpening her thinking instead of dulling it. 3 blocks from her apartment, she passed a small Italian restaurant with a handwritten sign taped inside the glass door. Serving staff needed for a private event. 1 night only. Cash paid same evening. Nora stopped walking. She had $11 left in her checking account and a stranger's 20 folded into her coat pocket. The notebook in her bag held 3 weeks of evidence nobody would ever ask to see, evidence that had cost her a job instead of saving it. There was a kind of bitter clarity in standing outside that restaurant window, in knowing that the same sharp eyes that had gotten her fired that morning were the only thing standing between her and an empty refrigerator by the weekend. She pushed open the door and asked for the job before she had time to talk herself out of it. The man inside, an older gentleman with flour on his sleeves, looked her over for exactly as long as it took to decide she was sober and presentable, then handed her a black apron and a clipboard. "Private party," he said. 12 guests. Important people. Keep the wine glasses full, keep your opinions to yourself, and don't ask anyone their name. Nora nodded. She had spent her whole life being underestimated by people who never bothered to ask her name either, so the instruction did not bother her at all. She did not know, standing there with a borrowed apron in her hands and $11 in her account, that the dinner she was about to serve would be the last ordinary night of her old life. She only knew that her stomach was empty, her rent was due, and somewhere behind the kitchen doors waited a room full of men who counted money for a living, men who had never once needed someone like her, until tonight. She tied the apron strings behind her back, the same way she had tied them that morning before everything fell apart, and walked toward the kitchen with her chin level and her eyes already cataloging the room. The kitchen smelled like garlic and scorched butter, and the chef barely glanced at her as he barked instructions about which dishes went where. Nora listened once and remembered all of it, the way she remembered everything, and within 20 minutes, she was moving through the dining room like she had worked there for years instead of 20 minutes. The private room sat behind a set of frosted glass doors at the back of the restaurant, far enough from the main floor that ordinary diners would never glance inside. Nora pushed through with a tray of bread and butter, expecting the usual table of businessmen complaining about golf scores. Instead, she found 12 men in tailored suits sitting around a long table, the air thick with cigar smoke despite the visible no smoking sign on the wall, and a silence that settled over the room the moment she entered. Every head turned toward her at once, the way a pack of animals turns toward an unfamiliar sound. At the head of the table sat a man who did not turn his head at all. He simply watched her in the reflection of his wineglass, unhurried, the way a person watches weather they already know is coming. Nora set the bread down without spilling a single crumb, refilled water glasses without being asked, and retreated to the kitchen with her pulse only slightly faster than usual. She told herself it was nothing. Rich men having dinner. Rich men who tipped well if a server stayed invisible enough. She had no idea that the man at the head of the table had already noticed 3 things about her in under a minute, and that none of those 3 things had anything to do with how quickly she poured wine. By the time she returned with the next course, the conversation in the room had shifted from quiet murmurs to something sharper, something with an edge underneath the polite words. Numbers were being mentioned, a shipment, a discrepancy. Voices that had started calm were climbing toward accusation, the same shape of conversation Nora had walked away from that very morning, except dressed in better suits and quieter rage. She set down a plate of risotto in front of a younger man near the middle of the table, the one doing most of the talking, the one insisting that the missing $200,000 had simply evaporated somewhere between the warehouse and the docks. Nora had no business listening. She knew that. She kept her eyes down and her hands steady, and let the words wash past her, the way she had trained herself to let Harold's accusations wash past her that same morning. Except the numbers did not add up, and Nora's mind had never once in her life been able to let a wrong number simply pass by unnoticed. The young man claimed the shipment total was $400,000. The man 2 seats down, the one who had apparently overseen the loading, insisted it had always been $380. Somewhere in between, someone wanted to know where the other $20,000 had gone, and the conversation was sliding toward the kind of tension that made even hardened men shift in their chairs. Nora set down the last plate, straightened, and was 3 steps from the door when the man at the head of the table finally spoke for the first time all evening. "You, the girl with the bread." The room went silent again, faster this time. Nora turned. Every man at the table was looking at her now, and there was nowhere to look that did not feel like standing in the middle of a road with headlights coming from both directions. "Yes, sir. You've been standing in this room for 10 minutes listening to grown men argue about money. What do you think happened to it?" It was, on its surface, an impossible question, the kind designed to humiliate a waitress who had no business being asked her opinion on anything beyond bread baskets. But Nora had been doing math in her head since the moment she walked into the room, the way she always did without meaning to, sorting numbers the way other people doodled on napkins. "The shipment total wasn't wrong," she said. "The loading manifest was counted twice. Page 4 and page 6 list the same 6 pallets under 2 different reference numbers. If you subtract the duplicate, your 380 matches your 400 exactly, once you account for the deposit already logged against the second pallet group." Silence. She had not meant to say all of that out loud. She had meant to apologize and leave the room, but once the numbers were in front of her, refusing to say them out loud felt like leaving a door open on a winter night, and Nora had never once in her life been able to walk away from an open door. The young man at the middle of the table opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, his face draining of color as he flipped back through the papers in front of him with shaking fingers. The man at the head of the table did not smile. He did not nod. He simply watched her with an expression Nora could not read, the kind of stillness that belonged to a man used to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, and said nothing else for the rest of the meal. Nora returned to the kitchen with her heart hammering, and her hands perfectly steady, the same trick she had used that morning, the same trick that had carried her through every humiliation life had handed her since she was old enough to remember being underestimated. She finished her shift, collected her cash payment from the older man with flour on his sleeves, and walked home through streets that felt colder than they had that morning, though nothing about the temperature had actually changed. She did not see the black car parked across from the restaurant, idling without its headlights on, the driver watching her walk the entire 3 blocks home before pulling away into the dark. 3 days passed before Nora understood how completely her life had narrowed. She applied to 4 restaurants, 2 grocery stores, and a call center that promised flexible hours and delivered nothing but a polite rejection email. Her landlord left a note under her door, reminding her that rent was due in 9 days, as if she needed reminding, as if the number had not already been sitting in her head every hour since she woke up. She was counting coins for the laundromat when her phone rang from a number she did not recognize. "Is this Nora Whitfield?" The voice belonged to a woman, brisk and professional, the kind of voice that answered phones in offices with carpeted floors and real coffee instead of instant. Nora said yes, cautious, half expecting a collections call. "My name is Diane Foss. I'm calling on behalf of Callaway Provisions. We understand you have strong bookkeeping instincts, and we have a temporary position that needs filling immediately. The pay is $800 a week, cash, with the possibility of permanent placement if things work out." Nora sat very still on the edge of her bed, the roll of quarters forgotten in her palm. "I don't have a bookkeeping background. I waited tables." "We're aware," Diane said, and there was something in the way she said it, something that told Nora this woman knew exactly where Nora had been 3 nights ago, exactly what she had said about a loading manifest in a private dining room she had no business being in. "We're not looking for a background. We're looking for an instinct, and you appear to have one. Be at the address I'm about to text you tomorrow morning at 8. Wear something professional." The call ended before Nora could ask a single question, and somehow that fact unsettled her more than anything the woman had actually said. She looked at the text that arrived a moment later, an address downtown she did not recognize, and felt the same cold clarity she had felt outside the diner 3 days earlier, the clarity that came whenever her old life closed a door and a stranger held open a new one instead. $800 a week was more money than she had ever made in a month at the diner. It was also, she understood without needing anyone to explain it to her, the kind of money that came from people who did not advertise what their company actually did. She thought about the silence that had fallen over that private dining room. She thought about 12 men in expensive suits arguing over $20,000 like it was pocket change. She thought about her empty refrigerator and the note under her door, and the way her landlord's handwriting had pressed so hard into the paper it left an impression on the page beneath it. She went to bed and set her alarm for 6. The building the next morning looked nothing like she expected. No flashing signs, no men in dark coats standing at the entrance. Nothing that matched the version of this story she had built in her head overnight. It was simply an office building, 6 floors of glass and steel, with Callaway Provisions printed in clean silver letters beside the lobby directory, sandwiched between a law firm and an insurance company, as if it belonged there as ordinarily as either of them. A security guard checked her name against a list, handed her a visitor badge, and directed her to the 4th floor without a single word more than necessary. The elevator opened onto a reception area that smelled faintly of fresh paint and stronger coffee, and a man was already waiting for her there, tall and broad-shouldered in a gray suit that fit too well to have come off any rack. He introduced himself as Gareth Lowell, and his handshake was firm enough to leave an impression but not quite firm enough to be a warning. "You're punctual," he said, like it surprised him. "Most people we bring in late aren't. Come on, I'll show you where you're working." He led her down a hallway lined with closed office doors, past a glass-walled conference room where 2 men in shirt sleeves were arguing quietly over a laptop screen, and into a smaller office with a desk, a computer, and 3 thick folders stacked neatly in the corner. "Your job today is simple," Gareth said. "Those folders contain invoices from 3 different suppliers over the last quarter. Cross-reference them against the totals in the spreadsheet on the desktop. Flag anything that looks wrong. Take your time, we're not in a hurry. Nora opened the first folder and understood within the first 10 pages that someone was watching to see exactly how good her instincts really were. The invoices were mundane on their surface. Crates of restaurant equipment, bulk shipments of imported olive oil, industrial freezer units, the kind of paperwork that would put most people to sleep within the hour. But buried on page 17, between two ordinary deliveries, sat an invoice for a shipment that did not match anything in the spreadsheet at all. The dollar amount was correct, down to the last cent. The supplier name was correct. But the delivery date listed a Sunday, and Nora happened to know, because she had grown up 3 blocks from the warehouse district listed on the invoice, that nothing on that particular street ever received deliveries on a Sunday. The loading docks closed for the weekend. Everyone in that neighborhood knew it the way they knew which stores didn't take credit cards. She flagged it, wrote a single line of explanation in the margin, and kept working through the rest of the folder without slowing down. By noon, she had found 2 more inconsistencies, smaller ones, the kind that might have been simple clerical mistakes if she hadn't already proven she had an eye for the kind that weren't mistakes at all. Gareth came to collect the folders at exactly 1 o'clock, flipped to the page she had flagged first, and went very still for a long moment. "You found this in 3 hours. It wasn't hidden well," Nora said, which was true, though she suspected the moment the words left her mouth that perhaps it had been hidden exactly well enough for everyone who came before her. Gareth did not respond to that. He simply closed the folder, told her to take a lunch break, and disappeared down the hallway with the kind of quick, purposeful walk that suggested he was going to deliver news to someone whose opinion mattered a great deal more than his own. Nora ate her sandwich alone in a small break room with a window overlooking the street, and tried not to think too hard about what kind of business kept invoices like that buried in ordinary paperwork in the first place. She had grown up poor enough to know that some questions were better left unasked, if you wanted to keep eating regular meals, and for the moment, eating regular meals mattered more to her than the answer. The afternoon brought a different kind of test. A man she had not met before stepped into her office without knocking, set a single sheet of paper on her desk, and asked her to read it without offering his name or any context at all. The sheet listed a series of cash deposits across 6 weeks, organized by date, with a running total at the bottom. "Add it up," the man said, out loud. "Now." Nora's eyes moved down the column once, the numbers settling into place in her mind, the way they always did, quick and certain and impossible to argue with. $41,612, she said. "But your total at the bottom says 41,800. Someone added an extra 188 that doesn't belong in the column." The man's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way a door shifts when someone tests whether it's locked. "Do it again, from memory. Don't look at the page." Nora closed her eyes and recited the entire column back to him without a single number out of place, because numbers did not leave her the way they left everyone else. They simply stayed, filed away in some quiet corner of her mind, waiting to be useful. When she opened her eyes, the man was already gone, and the sheet of paper had disappeared with him. She did not see Edward Calloway until the very end of the day, when the office had mostly emptied, and the hallway lights had dimmed to the kind of low evening glow that made the whole floor feel like it belonged to someone else entirely. He stood in the doorway of her small office without announcing himself, the same way he had watched her across the dinner table 3 nights earlier, patient and unreadable. "You remember me," Nora said, because it seemed pointless to pretend otherwise. "I remember everyone who corrects me in front of 12 other men and turns out to be right." He stepped into the room and glanced at the folder on her desk, the one with her careful handwriting in the margins. "Gareth tells me you found a hole in our paperwork in 3 hours, that 2 accountants missed for 6 months. I don't know anything about accounting. I just don't like it when numbers lie." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Nora understood she had said exactly the right thing without trying to. "Numbers lie all the time," Edward said. "Most people just don't know enough to catch them at it. I have a business that depends entirely on people not noticing certain things, and an equal number of problems that come from people noticing the wrong things at the wrong time. I think you might be useful to me in ways that have nothing to do with invoices." Nora felt the room tilt slightly, though nothing in it had actually moved. "What kind of business is this exactly?" Edward studied her for a long moment, long enough that she began to wonder if she had finally asked the one question that would get her thrown out onto the street with her $800 and no further explanation at all. The kind of business where the people who ask too many questions too soon don't usually last long enough to get good answers, he said, and the kind where the people who keep their eyes open and their mouths shut sometimes end up running entire departments within a year. Which kind of person are you, Nora? She thought about Harold's diner, about the apron folded on the counter, about the $11 that had been sitting in her account 3 nights ago, and the $900 that would be sitting there by tomorrow if she said the right thing now. The second kind, she said. Edward nodded once, like a decision had been made somewhere behind his calm expression, and turned to leave without another word. Be here tomorrow at 8, he said over his shoulder. Bring nothing but your eyes. The door closed behind him, and Nora sat alone in the small office with the hallway lights dimming around her, understanding with absolute clarity that she had just walked through a door that did not open easily in the other direction, and that some part of her, the part that had spent her whole life being underestimated and unpaid for the one real skill she had, did not want it to. She returned the next morning at exactly 8, badge already clipped to her blazer, and found the office transformed from the quiet, half-empty space of the evening before into something humming with a different kind of energy entirely. Phones rang in 3 different rooms at once. A printer in the corner spat out pages faster than anyone collected them, and standing near the coffee machine, watching her with open suspicion the moment she stepped off the elevator, was a man Nora had not met yet, but instantly understood she was not going to like. He was younger than Gareth, maybe 30, with the kind of carefully styled hair that suggested he spent more time on his appearance than his actual work. He did not introduce himself. He simply looked at her, then at the visitor badge still clipped to her blazer from the day before, and said, loud enough for the whole reception area to hear, "We're hiring waitresses now?" A few heads turned. Nora felt the old, familiar heat climb up her neck, the same heat she had felt standing in Harold's diner with every customer staring at her, and she made the same choice she had made then. She did not flinch. I caught $188 that 2 full-time accountants missed for 6 months, she said, pleasant as anything. So I suppose the answer is yes, when the waitress is better at the job than the accountants. Someone near the printer laughed, quickly disguised as a cough. The man's jaw tightened in a way that told Nora she had just made an enemy faster than she had ever managed to make one in her life. But Gareth appeared at her side before the moment could stretch any longer, steering her gently by the elbow toward the hallway. That's Nathan Pierce, Gareth said once they were out of earshot. He's been with Mr. Calloway for 6 years. Came up through the financial side. Expected to run this whole department himself eventually. I'd be careful around him if I were you. Why? Because men who expect things and don't get them tend to remember exactly who got in their way. It was not the kind of warning Nora had ever received at the diner, where the worst consequence of stepping on the wrong toes was an unpleasant shift schedule. She filed it away regardless, the same way she filed away every number and every face, and followed Gareth into a larger office on the far side of the floor, one with real windows and a view of the street 6 stories below. The work that day was harder than the folder of invoices had been, denser, more layered, the kind of paperwork that required her to hold 3 sets of numbers in her head at once and notice where they failed to agree with each other in small, deliberate ways. She did not understand everything she was looking at. She understood enough to know that some of the money moving through these documents was not moving in straight lines, and that whoever had built this particular maze had built it carefully enough that most people would simply give up trying to follow it. Nora had never once in her life given up on a number that didn't make sense. Around 4 in the afternoon, she overheard a conversation through a half-closed door that she was certain she was not meant to hear. 2 men discussing someone named Felix, who had apparently made a costly miscalculation on a shipment the month before, and was no longer with the company. The way they said it, no longer with the company, carried a weight that had nothing to do with a resignation letter, and Nora felt the temperature of the room drop several degrees even though nothing physical in it had changed at all. She did not ask what had happened to Felix. She had learned, in less than 2 days, exactly which questions came with consequences attached. She finished her work in silence, handed her findings to Gareth without comment, and rode the elevator down to the lobby alone, her own reflection staring back at her in the polished steel doors the entire way down. By the time she stepped out onto the street, The sun had already dropped behind the buildings, and the city had taken on the gray, uncertain light of early evening. She thought about Felix, whoever he had been, and what it meant that men spoke about his absence, the way they might speak about a misplaced filing cabinet. She thought about Nathan Pierce's tight jaw and Gareth's quiet warning. She thought about the $900 that would land in her account by the end of the week, more money than she had ever held on to for longer than it took to pay rent. She kept walking anyway. There was a version of herself, she knew, that would have turned around days ago, gone back to filling out applications at restaurants that would never pay her what she was actually worth, content to be underestimated for the rest of her life, because underestimated at least was safe. But Nora had spent her whole life being the smartest person in rooms that never once acknowledged it, and something about Edward Calloway's quiet attention, about being seen clearly for the first time by someone powerful enough that his opinion actually mattered, had settled into her chest like a hook she did not particularly want to remove. She told herself she would stay only as long as it took to save enough money to leave on her own terms. She did not entirely believe herself, even as she thought it, and that uncertainty followed her all the way home through the darkening streets, sitting in her stomach like a stone she had swallowed without meaning to. 6 weeks passed, and Nora's life rearranged itself so completely around the 4th floor of that glass building that she sometimes had trouble remembering what her days had looked like before it. She no longer carried trays of bread to strangers who never learned her name. She carried folders into rooms where men twice her age went quiet the moment she opened her mouth, because by now they had all learned, one by one, the same lesson Edward Calloway had learned on her very first night in that private dining room. Her desk had moved twice, each time closer to Edward's own office, until by the start of the 7th week, she had a permanent seat just outside his door, close enough that Gareth had started calling her, half joking and half not, the only person in the building who actually knew where all the money went. It was not entirely a joke. Nora had found 4 more discrepancies in her first month, each one larger than the last, each one traced back through layers of paperwork that had clearly been designed by someone who understood exactly how most people's attention worked, and exactly how to slip past it. She did not know yet what all the money was actually for, where every dollar eventually landed once it left the company's official books, and she had stopped asking that particular question out loud weeks ago. She had learned to read the answer in the silences instead, in the way certain rooms went quiet when certain subjects came up, in the careful blankness that settled over Gareth's face whenever a shipment manifest mentioned a destination that wasn't a restaurant at all. She told herself the not knowing was a kind of safety. Some mornings, she almost believed it. Her skill, she had come to understand, was not really about numbers at all, though numbers were where it had started. It was about noticing the shape of a lie before anyone had finished telling it, the half-second of hesitation before a man confirmed a number he had not actually checked, the way certain people's eyes moved up and to the left when they were inventing a detail rather than remembering one. She had always noticed these things even as a child, even as a waitress refilling coffee for men who never once suspected she was cataloging every flinch and stammer at their table. Here, finally, someone was willing to pay her for it. In a meeting in late October, a supplier sat across the table from Edward, insisting that a delayed shipment had been the fault of a customs error entirely outside his control. He had a folder of documents to prove it, dates and stamps and signatures that all appeared to line up perfectly. Nora, seated quietly near the wall the way she always was now, watched the man's hands instead of his paperwork, watched the way his thumb pressed too hard against the edge of the folder every time he said the word customs, and leaned forward just enough to be noticed. "Ask him which port the shipment cleared through," she said quietly. Edward asked. The supplier hesitated half a second too long before naming a port that, as it turned out, had been closed for maintenance the entire week in question, a detail Nora had read in passing in a shipping newsletter 2 days earlier, and simply remembered, the way she remembered everything. The supplier left the meeting considerably paler than he had entered it, and Edward did not say a single word to Nora about it afterward, which she had learned by now was its own kind of compliment. He did not thank people for doing their job well. He simply kept giving them more important jobs, which was its own quiet proof that he had noticed. There was one meeting in early November that Nora thought about for a long time afterward, longer than she thought about any of the discrepancies or the late nights or the growing weight of her own paycheck. A man named Carl had come to the building asking for an extension on a debt he owed Edward's organization, a debt tied to a restaurant he had borrowed against months earlier, and could no longer repay on schedule. He sat across from Edward with a folder of his own, much thinner than the suppliers usually brought, his hands trembling slightly as he laid out his case. Nora sat near the wall, as she always did, watching. Edward listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, patient and still. And when Carl finished speaking, Edward simply turned to Nora and asked her, in front of the trembling man, whether his numbers added up. They did not. Carl had inflated his restaurant's monthly revenue by nearly a third in the documents he had brought, presumably to make himself look like a safer bet for more time, and Nora saw it within the first page, the same way she saw everything, the gap between what a person claimed and what was actually true. His real revenue is closer to $11,000 a month, not 16, Nora said quietly. His lease payment alone is higher than what he's claiming for total overhead. Carl's face went the color of old paper. He started to argue, then stopped, because there was nothing left to argue once the numbers had been said out loud in a room with no door he could politely excuse himself through. Edward studied Carl for a long, silent moment, the kind of silence Nora had come to understand was its own form of communication entirely. He did not raise his voice, he did not move from his chair. He simply said that he expected the original payment schedule honored in full, that lying to him in his own office was a mistake people generally only made once, and that Carl would do well to remember that mistakes of that particular kind tended to cost considerably more than the debt itself. Carl left the building considerably faster than he had entered it, and Nora sat very still in her chair afterward, aware of her own pulse in a way she usually wasn't, aware that the numbers she had just laid bare in that room were not simply numbers anymore. They were leverage. They were the difference between a man keeping his restaurant and a man losing considerably more than that, and she had handed Edward that difference as easily as she had once handed truckers their morning coffee. She told herself that Carl had lied first, that nobody had forced him to inflate his numbers, that all she had done was tell the truth the way she always told the truth, and none of it made the knot in her stomach loosen even slightly on her walk home that evening. This was the part of the job nobody had explained to her on her first day, the part that didn't show up in any folder of invoices. Her gift, the one thing about herself she had never once been ashamed of, was being used now to find exactly where people were weakest, and weakness, in this building, was never simply noted and set aside. It was used. She thought about turning back. She thought about it seriously, for the first time since the night Diane Foss had called her about a job that paid $800 a week, and asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer. But turning back meant Harold's Diner, or somewhere just like it, meant being the smartest person in a room that would never once acknowledge it, meant $40 accusations, and apron strings tied behind her back for people who would forget her name the moment she clocked out for the last time. She kept her seat by the wall. She told herself she would draw a line somewhere, eventually, some point past which she would not let her own talent be used. She did not yet know where that line was, and some nights, lying awake in an apartment with a refrigerator that was finally, reliably full, she suspected the not knowing was its own kind of answer. Nathan Pierce noticed too, though his version of noticing looked nothing like Edward's. It started small, the way these things always seem to start. A report Nora had finished correctly came back from Nathan's desk with a note claiming an error that did not actually exist, forcing her to redo 2 hours of work, proving she had been right the first time. A meeting she had been told to attend got moved at the last minute without anyone telling her, leaving her standing outside a locked conference room while a decision was made about a project she had spent a week preparing numbers for. Small things, deniable things, the kind of things that, taken individually, looked like simple office friction, but taken together formed a pattern Nora recognized instantly, because recognizing patterns was the entire reason she was sitting in that building in the first place. She mentioned it once to Gareth, carefully, without accusation, simply laying out the timeline the way she might lay out a column of numbers that didn't quite add up. Gareth's expression didn't change, but he was quiet for a long moment before he answered. Nathan was supposed to have your seat by now. He's been waiting 3 years for Mr. Calloway to trust him with the kind of work you've been doing in 6 weeks. That's not an excuse. It's just an explanation. Watch your back with him, and don't ever let him see your numbers before they're finished. She took the advice seriously, the way she took most warnings now, filing it alongside everything else she had learned about the careful architecture of this world, the unspoken rules that governed who could be trusted with what, and how quickly trust, once given, could be taken away again. She still called Maggie sometimes, on the nights when the new version of her life felt too unfamiliar to carry alone. They met for coffee on a Sunday, the first time in over a month, and Maggie studied her across the table with the particular concern of someone watching a friend's life change in ways she did not entirely understand. "You look different," Maggie said. "Good different, but different." "I'm sleeping better," Nora said, which was true, even though she left out the part where the better sleep came from finally having enough money to stop worrying about rent, and not from any particular peace of mind about the source of that money. "Harold fired Kyle, by the way, 2 weeks after he fired you. Turns out somebody finally checked the register footage." Maggie said it like it was supposed to feel like justice, and maybe it was, except Nora found she could barely summon the energy to care anymore about a $40 accusation in a diner that felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. "That's good," she said, because it seemed like the right thing to say, and changed the subject before Maggie could ask the harder question sitting behind her eyes, the one about what exactly Nora did now for a company that paid her in cash, and never once mentioned what restaurant supplies actually meant. A few nights later, Edward stayed late at the office, something he rarely did once the building had emptied out around them, and found Nora still at her desk finishing the same report she would end up carrying into the meeting 3 days from then. He didn't sit. He leaned against the doorframe instead, arms crossed, watching her work for a moment before he spoke. "You haven't asked me what we actually moved through this company," he said. "Most people in your position would have asked by now, out of fear or curiosity, or because they thought it gave them leverage to know." Nora set down her pen. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted me to know. Until then, the less I officially know, the less anyone can ask me to explain under oath." For the first time since she had met him, Edward laughed, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "That's the most sensible thing anyone in this building has said to me in a year. I grew up watching my mother get questioned by people who wanted to know things she didn't actually have answers for," Nora said, before she could decide whether the detail was safe to share. "I learned early that knowing less can be its own kind of protection." Edward studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and for once it didn't feel like the calculating stillness he wore in every meeting. It felt almost like recognition, like he had just placed her inside a category of person he didn't often meet and trusted even less often than that. "You're careful," he said. "Careful people last longer in this business than clever ones. You happen to be both, which is rarer than you'd think." He pushed off the doorframe, already turning to leave. "Finish the report. I want it Thursday, not Friday. And Nora, whatever Nathan's been telling people about your numbers, don't bother defending yourself to him. Defend yourself to me, and only when I ask." He was gone before she could ask how he knew about Nathan at all, and she sat with that question turning over in her mind long after the hallway lights had dimmed around her, the unsettling comfort of being seen by a man who apparently missed very little, settling alongside the unease of being watched by one who clearly missed even less than that. She walked home that night, turning his words over in her mind, the loneliness she had felt with Maggie days earlier, replaced now by something stranger, the particular ache of being understood by exactly the wrong kind of person, in exactly the wrong kind of building, for exactly the wrong reasons. The following evening, working late on a report Edward had asked for personally, Nora passed Nathan Pierce's office on her way to the copier and saw him through the half-open door, hunched over his desk with his phone pressed to his ear, voice low enough that she only caught fragments. She wasn't trying to listen. She told herself that afterward, more than once, the way people tell themselves things they want to believe. But Nora's mind did not work like other people's minds. It caught fragments and held on to them whether she wanted it to or not, sorting and filing the way it always did, and the fragments it caught that night were these: her own name, the word mistake, and a date, 3 days from now, repeated twice like Nathan was making certain whoever was on the other end of that call understood exactly when something was supposed to happen. She kept walking toward the copier, made her copies, and did not look back toward his office on her way past again. She told herself it was probably nothing. She told herself this the way she had once told herself the $40 missing from Harold's register would surely be explained away once someone bothered to check the numbers, and she had been wrong about that too. 3 days, Nathan had said, 3 days from a date that, when she finally let herself count it out properly walking home that night, landed exactly on the day she was scheduled to present her final reconciliation of the quarterly accounts, directly to Edward Calloway himself. For the first time since she had walked through the doors of that glass building, Nora found she could not entirely trust the numbers in her own head to keep her safe. The next 3 days passed slower than any 3 days Nora had lived through since the morning Harold accused her of stealing $40 she had never touched. She went over her quarterly reconciliation report a dozen times, then a dozen more, hunting for the mistake Nathan had promised someone over the phone, and found nothing. Every column balanced. Every total matched its source document. If there was a hole somewhere in her work, she could not find it, and not finding it frightened her more than finding it would have. She slept badly. She caught herself, more than once, standing at her own desk, re-adding sums she had already triple-checked, the numbers blurring slightly from sheer repetition, her mind circling the same closed loop without ever landing on an answer. Gareth noticed the shadows under her eyes on the second morning and asked if everything was all right. She said yes, because she still didn't have proof of anything, only a fragment of an overheard phone call, and a feeling in her stomach that refused to settle no matter how many times she told herself it was nothing. On the second afternoon, she passed Nathan near the break room, and he stopped just long enough to pour himself a coffee he didn't appear to actually want, his eyes flicking toward her with the kind of polite, surface-level concern that fooled almost everyone except the one person in the building trained to notice exactly what lay underneath it. "You look tired," he said. "Big presentation coming up. Must be a lot of pressure, putting together a whole quarter's worth of numbers all by yourself." "I manage," Nora said. "I'm sure you do." He stirred his coffee slowly, unhurried, the same unhurried patience Edward wore in every meeting, except on Nathan it looked borrowed, a costume rather than a skin. Funny thing about numbers, though, doesn't matter how careful you are. All it takes is one mistake, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and years of careful work can unravel in an afternoon. I'd hate to see that happen to someone who's worked as hard as you have. It was, on its surface, nothing. A colleague offering hollow sympathy before a stressful meeting. But Nora heard the shape of the threat underneath the pleasant words exactly the way she had once heard the shape of a lie hiding inside Carl's inflated revenue figures, and she understood, standing there with her own untouched coffee cooling in her hands, that whatever Nathan had planned was already in motion, set loose somewhere in the system where she could not yet see it. "Is there something specific you're trying to tell me, Nathan?" His smile didn't waver. "Just being friendly. Good luck tomorrow." He left her standing alone in the break room with a coffee she no longer wanted, and Nora spent the rest of that evening combing back through every file she had touched in the past month, searching for whatever trap he had already sprung shut somewhere just out of her line of sight, and found, infuriatingly, nothing at all. Whatever he had done it well enough that even her own careful eyes couldn't locate it in advance, which meant there was nothing left to do but wait for it to surface on its own terms, in front of the one person whose opinion of her mattered more than anyone else's in that entire building. On the morning of the third day, she walked into the building with her report printed and bound, every number checked one final time before sunrise, and told herself that whatever Nathan had planned, she had at least done everything in her power to make certain it wasn't her own error he found. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock, in the same conference room with the glass walls where she had once watched Carl's hands tremble around a folder of inflated numbers. Edward sat at the head of the table. Gareth sat to his right. Nathan Pierce sat near the far end, close enough to watch but distant enough to appear uninvolved, and Nora understood the moment she saw the careful, pleasant blankness of his expression that whatever was coming, he already knew exactly how the next 10 minutes would unfold. She began the presentation the way she had rehearsed it, walking through the quarterly totals, the reconciled accounts, the small adjustments she had flagged and corrected over the past several weeks. Her voice stayed steady. Her hands did not shake. For the first 6 pages, everything went exactly as it should have. Then Edward turned to page 7, and the room went very quiet. "Explain this line," he said, and turned the report around so Nora could see it from his side of the table. There, in the middle of a column she had checked and rechecked a dozen times over 3 sleepless nights, sat a transfer of $140,000 to an account number she did not recognize, dated the week before, marked with her own initials in the approval field exactly the way every other entry on that page was marked. Nora's stomach dropped through the floor. "I didn't approve this," she said. "I've never seen this account number before in my life." "Your initials are on it," Edward said, his voice giving away nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if he had raised it. "Your login was used to access the file at 4:17 in the afternoon, on the day this transfer was logged. I have the system records right here. Across the table, Nathan Pierce's expression remained perfectly, carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that took genuine effort to maintain, and Nora understood with absolute clarity, the same clarity that had once told her exactly where $40 missing had gone, that she was looking at the man who had built this trap, watching it close around her exactly as carefully as he had planned it to. I was in a vendor meeting at 4:17 that afternoon, Nora said. I can prove it. There were 6 other people in that room. Then prove it, Edward said. Tonight. Because right now, on paper, you moved $140,000 of my money to an account I've never authorized, and I don't extend second chances to people who do that, regardless of how much I've come to value their other talents. You have until I arrive tomorrow morning. After that, this becomes a different kind of conversation entirely. He did not say what kind of conversation. He did not need to. Nora had spent enough weeks in that building now to understand exactly the shape of the silence that followed people who lost Edward's trust, the same silence that had once swallowed a man named Felix without leaving so much as a ripple behind him. The meeting ended. People filed out of the room without meeting her eyes, the particular cowardice of colleagues who suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere the moment someone's career looked like it might be ending. Gareth lingered a moment longer than the rest, his expression unreadable, and told her quietly that the system logs were stored on the 3rd floor, in a server room that required a badge most junior employees did not have, before he too disappeared down the hallway, leaving her alone with a folder that had just turned into the most dangerous object she had ever held. Nora sat alone in the empty conference room for several minutes after everyone else had gone, the glass walls suddenly feeling less like windows and more like the sides of a tank. Every person who passed in the hallway outside glancing in at her the way people glance at something they expect to disappear soon. She thought, briefly, about calling Maggie, about hearing a voice from a life simple enough that a missing $40 had once felt like the worst thing that could happen to her. She decided against it. There was nothing Maggie could do from outside this building, and explaining any of it over the phone would have meant explaining far more about her new life than Nora was prepared to say out loud to anyone. She thought instead about her mother, years ago, sitting across a kitchen table from men in cheap suits, asking questions she didn't have good answers for, and how Nora had promised herself, even as a child watching that particular kind of fear settle over her mother's face, that she would never again be the person in the room without the answer. She had built her entire adult life on that promise without ever fully admitting it to herself. Every memorized number and noticed lie another small brick in a wall, meant to keep her from ever again standing helpless in front of someone deciding her fate for her. She was not going to be helpless now either. Nora did not cry, the same way she had not cried outside Harold's diner 3 months earlier. She sat very still for exactly 30 seconds, let the fear move through her and out the other side the way she had trained herself to do her entire life. And then she started thinking. Nathan had needed her login credentials to make this work. That meant either he had guessed her password, unlikely given how carefully Gareth had drilled security protocols into every new hire, or he had accessed her computer directly while she was somewhere else in the building. Either way, somewhere in this building's systems, a record existed of exactly when and where that access had happened, a digital fingerprint as precise and unforgiving as any column of numbers she had ever balanced. She found Gareth's badge access list in a drawer she wasn't technically supposed to know about, the kind of small administrative oversight that happens in every office no matter how careful the people running it claim to be, and used it to reach the 3rd floor server room an hour after everyone else had gone home for the evening. The room was cold and humming, rows of black servers blinking quietly in the dark, and Nora sat down at the single terminal in the corner, with the kind of focus she had not allowed herself to feel since the meeting that morning, every other thought in her mind narrowing down to a single, precise question. When, exactly, had someone logged into her account, and from where? She was halfway through her 3rd hour, scrolling through a list of badge entries that meant nothing yet, when she heard the elevator chime down the hall. Nora froze, her hand still resting on the keyboard, every muscle in her body suddenly, perfectly still. Footsteps moved along the corridor outside the server room, unhurried, confident, the particular rhythm of someone who belonged in the building at 1 in the morning, and had no reason to walk quietly. She killed the monitor's brightness, slid off the chair, and pressed herself into the narrow gap between 2 server racks, the hum of the machines loud enough, she hoped, to cover the sound of her own breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened at all. Then the door handle turned, and the footsteps moved on, continuing down the hallway toward the stairwell at the far end, fading into nothing. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and stayed pressed against the cold metal racks a full minute longer, before she trusted her legs to carry her back to the terminal. She did not know who had been in the hallway. She told herself it was a security guard on his usual rounds, because the alternative, that Nathan himself had come back to check on his own handiwork, or worse, to make certain nobody was looking too closely at exactly the records she was looking at right now, was not a thought she had room to entertain, while 4 hours of work still sat unfinished in front of her. She worked faster after that, her earlier methodical patience sharpened now by something closer to fear, and it was in that sharpened, urgent state, just past 1 in the morning, that the pattern she had been hunting finally surfaced from beneath the noise. It took her 4 hours. The system was not designed for someone without proper training to navigate easily, and twice she nearly locked herself out entirely trying to access logs that were clearly meant for IT administrators, rather than accountants who had learned everything they knew about computers from working a diner's outdated register. But Nora had built her entire life around the principle that any sufficiently organized set of information would eventually yield its pattern to someone patient enough to keep looking, and just past 1 in the morning, sitting alone in a cold room full of humming machines, she found it. Her login credentials had been used to access the financial system at 4:17 in the afternoon on the day in question, exactly as Edward had said, but the access had not come from her own desk. It had come from a workstation on the opposite side of the floor, a workstation that, according to the building's separate badge entry logs, had been occupied at that exact time by exactly one person, a man whose badge had scanned into that particular office at 4:09, 8 minutes before her stolen credentials were used to authorize a transfer she had never seen. Nathan Pierce's badge number sat on the screen in front of her, time-stamped and undeniable, the kind of detail that no amount of careful planning could explain away, because Nathan had made the one mistake everyone in his position eventually made. He had assumed that altering a single document was enough, without considering that an entire building full of badges and timestamps and login records existed quietly around him, recording the truth whether he wanted it to or not. Nora printed 3 copies of everything, badge logs and system access records and timestamps lined up side by side, in a sequence that told its own story, far more convincingly than any explanation she could have offered with words alone. She sat in the cold server room a moment longer than she needed to, letting the relief move through her slowly, carefully, the way she had learned to let every feeling move through her, instead of overwhelming her all at once. It was nearly 2 in the morning by the time she left the building, the streets outside empty and silver under the streetlights, her own footsteps the only sound on the sidewalk all the way home. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, mostly, exhausted, in a way that went deeper than the hour, the particular exhaustion of having spent an entire night proving she had not done something she would never have done in the first place, simply because someone else had decided her rapid rise needed to be stopped by whatever means were available to him. She thought, walking home through the empty streets, about how close the whole architecture of her new life had come to collapsing over a single afternoon's worth of careful sabotage, how thin the line truly was between being trusted completely and being destroyed entirely, in a world where trust, once broken, did not appear to come with a second chance attached. She set her alarm for 6, laid the folder of proof on her nightstand where she would see it the moment she woke, and lay in the dark for a long time before sleep finally found her, aware that tomorrow morning would decide far more than simply whether she kept her job. Edward arrived at the building at exactly 7:30, as he did every morning, and Nora was already waiting outside his office with the folder held flat against her chest, her eyes raw from a night without sleep, but her hands, as always, perfectly steady. He looked at her for a long moment before he said anything, reading something in her posture that told him this was not a conversation that needed to happen with anyone else in the room yet. "My office," he said, "now." She followed him in, set the folder on his desk, and opened it to the first page without waiting to be asked. She walked him through it the same way she had walked through every column of numbers she had ever laid out for him, calm and precise, no wasted words, the badge logs lined up beside the system access records in a sequence that told its own story, far more convincingly than any argument she could have built around them. My credentials were used from a workstation across the floor, she said. Nathan's badge scanned into that office 8 minutes before the transfer was logged. I have the exact timestamps. I was in a vendor meeting with 6 witnesses at 4:17 that afternoon. I can give you their names. Edward studied the pages for a long time, longer than he had studied anything in front of her before, his expression giving away nothing, while something behind his eyes worked through the implications layer by layer. When he finally looked up, there was no surprise in his face at all, only a kind of cold, settled certainty, the look of a man confirming something he had already half suspected and simply needed proof to act on. Get Gareth, he said, and get Nathan. Both of them, now. Nora found Gareth first, standing near the coffee machine with the same tired posture she had worn herself a few hours earlier, and the moment she said Edward needed him in his office, his face shifted into something alert and watchful, like a man who had been waiting for exactly this summons without knowing precisely when it would come. He didn't ask questions. He simply followed her down the hallway. Nathan was harder to find. He had not yet arrived at his desk, and for 3 long minutes Nora wondered whether he had somehow already learned that his plan had unraveled overnight, and decided not to show up at all. But he stepped off the elevator at 7:50, coffee in hand, the same careful, unhurried calm he always wore, and his expression flickered only slightly when he saw Nora and Gareth standing together outside Edward's office, waiting for him. "Mr. Calloway wants to see you," Gareth said. Whatever Nathan saw in their faces in that moment was enough to drain some of the color from his own. He set his coffee down on the nearest desk without comment and followed them inside. Edward did not raise his voice. Nora had learned by now that he never did, that the men who worked for him feared his quiet far more than they would ever have feared shouting, and watching him lay the folder open in front of Nathan, page by page, badge logs beside system records beside a printed list of names from a vendor meeting that placed Nora in a different room entirely, at the exact moment her credentials had supposedly been used. She understood she was watching a man dismantle another man's entire future, with nothing more than patience and proof. Nathan tried to argue, briefly, something about coincidence, about systems being unreliable, about how anyone could have accessed that workstation that afternoon. The words came out fast and thin, the particular desperation of someone watching a carefully built story collapse in real time, and Edward let him finish every sentence before responding, the silence afterward somehow louder than anything Nathan had actually said. 3 years, Edward said finally. 3 years I trusted you with numbers that could put me in considerable difficulty if they ever ended up in the wrong hands, and you decided the best use of that trust was trying to destroy someone whose only crime was being better at the job than you expected her to be. He closed the folder. Gareth will walk you out. Your access to this building ends the moment you leave this office, and I would think very carefully, Nathan, about who you discuss any of this with afterward. I have always been generous to people who keep my business private, even after they've stopped working for me. I have been considerably less generous to people who haven't. It was not a threat exactly, not in the way Nora had expected a threat to sound after weeks spent watching men like Carl walk out of this building considerably paler than they had walked in. It was simply a fact, stated plainly, the kind of fact that Nathan clearly understood far better than Nora did, because whatever color remained in his face drained away entirely, and he left the office without another word of argument, Gareth's hand resting lightly but firmly on his shoulder the entire way down the hallway. Nora never saw him again after that morning. Nobody in the building spoke about him afterward, the same careful, deliberate silence she had once heard wrapped around a man named Felix, and for the first time she understood that silence was not necessarily as ominous as it had once seemed. Sometimes it simply meant a problem had been removed, cleanly, without theater, in a world that preferred its conflicts resolved behind closed doors rather than out in the open where they might draw the wrong kind of attention. Edward sat back down at his desk once the office had emptied, and looked at Nora for a long moment, the same unreadable stillness she had grown used to over the past several months, except now, there was something underneath it she hadn't seen from him before, something that looked, if she squinted at it sideways, almost like respect. You could have come to me the moment you overheard him on the phone, he said. Saved yourself 3 days of sleepless nights. I didn't have proof yet, just a feeling. You don't strike me as a man who acts on feelings. No, Edward agreed, I don't. He leaned back in his chair, studying her the way he had studied her that very first night across a dinner table full of men arguing over $20,000. Nathan's old office is empty now. bigger than yours. Better view. I want you running the financial side of this operation, not sitting outside my door catching other people's mistakes. Your own desk, your own staff, a salary that reflects what you're actually worth, instead of what I was paying you to test whether you were worth anything at all. Nora felt something settle in her chest, a quiet, solid weight that had nothing to do with relief, and everything to do with the particular satisfaction of being seen clearly, finally, by someone whose seeing actually meant something in the world she now lived in. "What's the salary?" she asked, because some habits, the careful, hard-edged habits of a woman who had once counted quarters for the laundromat, did not disappear simply because the danger had passed. Edward almost smiled. He told her the number, and it was enough that she did not need to ask a follow-up question. She moved into Nathan's old office that same week, the view exactly as good as Edward had promised, the desk large enough that the folders no longer threatened to slide onto the floor the way they had in her old cramped space by the wall. She hired 2 junior staff within the month, both of them sharper than they let on in their interviews, both of them reminding her faintly of herself a year earlier, underestimated and overlooked everywhere they had worked before this. One of them, a quiet young man named Owen Brackett, came to her office on his 3rd week, looking the way Nora herself had once looked standing on the sidewalk outside Harold's diner, pale, and certain his career had just ended over a mistake he insisted he hadn't made. A senior manager from another floor had filed a complaint claiming Owen had misreported a delivery total, a careless error that, if true, would have cost him his job before he'd had time to properly start it. Nora pulled the original paperwork herself instead of taking either man's word for it, the way she always did now, the way nobody had ever bothered to do for her at the diner. It took her 11 minutes to find what she was looking for. The senior manager had transposed 2 digits in his own report, then blamed the discrepancy on the newest person in the building because new people rarely had anyone willing to check the numbers on their behalf. She walked into that manager's office without an appointment and laid both reports side by side on his desk, the same way Edward had once laid Nathan's badge logs out for him, calm and precise, and entirely without room for argument. "Owen's numbers are correct," she said. "Yours aren't. I'd appreciate it if the complaint were withdrawn before it reaches Mr. Calloway's desk, because if it doesn't, I'll be the one bringing it to him myself, along with an explanation of exactly whose math was wrong in the first place." The complaint disappeared by the end of the day. Owen thanked her so many times in the hallway afterward that she eventually had to tell him, gently, to stop, because watching his shoulders unclench from around his ears reminded her uncomfortably of a version of herself she preferred not to think about too often, the version who had once folded an apron on a counter and walked out into the cold with nobody standing behind her at all. "Nobody checked for me," she told him, before she could decide whether the sentence was wise to say out loud. "When I needed someone to look at the actual numbers, instead of just believing whoever spoke first and loudest. I'm not going to be the kind of person who lets that happen to somebody else, not when I have the ability to stop it." Owen didn't fully understand what she meant, not yet, not with only 3 weeks in the building behind him, but he nodded anyway, the particular grateful nod of someone who suspects he has just been handed something valuable without entirely knowing its full weight yet, and went back to his desk, considerably steadier than he had arrived at it. She called Maggie less often now, not out of any falling out, simply because the gap between their 2 lives had widened past the point where coffee on a Sunday could bridge it entirely. When they did meet, Maggie no longer asked the harder questions sitting behind her eyes, and Nora understood that her old friend had made a quiet decision somewhere along the way to accept the parts of Nora's new life she would never fully be told about, in exchange for keeping the parts of the friendship that still made sense. Harold's Diner closed 8 months later. The building sold to a developer who turned it into a sandwich shop with exposed brick walls and prices triple what the old menu had charged. Nora read about it in passing, in a local paper someone had left on the break room table, and felt nothing at all, which surprised her more than feeling something would have. The particular numbness of looking back at a life so completely outgrown it no longer seemed to belong to the same person. Edward called her into his office one evening that same autumn, nearly a year to the week since the dinner where she had first corrected a stranger's math over a tray of bread, and for once he did not have a folder waiting on the desk between them. He simply gestured to the chair across from him and waited until she sat down. "You've made this company considerably more money than I'm paying you," he said, "and considerably safer too, which matters more to me than the money does. I want you to know I'm aware of both things, and I don't say that to many people. Nora waited, sensing there was more coming. The particular stillness in the room telling her this was not simply a conversation about a raise. "I'm prepared to write you a check tonight," Edward continued. "Large enough that you could leave this building, leave this city if you wanted to, and never think about any of it again. No hard feelings, no questions asked. You've more than earned the right to walk away clean, if that's what you want." He folded his hands on the desk. "I've watched a great many people come through this office over the years, Nora. Most of them stayed for the money, right up until the money wasn't worth what staying cost them anymore. I'd rather know now, plainly, which kind of person you are, than find out the hard way 6 months from now." Nora thought about the question longer than she expected to, longer than she suspected Edward expected her to, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. She thought about the apron folded on Harold's counter, about $11 in a checking account, and a landlord's note pressed hard enough into paper to leave an impression on the page beneath it. She thought about Owen's shoulders unclenching in the hallway, about $140,000 she had proven, in one sleepless night, was never hers to lose. She thought about Carl's trembling hands, and the knot in her stomach that still hadn't fully disappeared, and the quiet, settled certainty that she did not actually want it to disappear, because that knot was the last honest thing keeping her from becoming someone she wouldn't recognize in a mirror. "I don't want the check," she said finally. "I want the office, and the title, and the chance to keep being the only person in this building who tells you the truth even when it costs someone else everything. That's worth more to me than money I'd spend the rest of my life trying not to think too hard about where it came from." Edward studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression settled into place, the way a key settles into a lock built specifically for it. "Good answer," he said, and didn't offer the check again. A few weeks after that conversation, Edward held another private dinner in the same frosted glass room at the same restaurant, where Nora had once carried bread to a table of strangers in a borrowed apron. This time, she did not enter through the kitchen. She walked through the front doors in a dark blue dress she had bought with her own money, was shown directly to the table by a host who clearly already knew her name, and took the seat at Edward's right hand without anyone in the room questioning whether she belonged there. A different young waitress carried in the bread that evening, nervous and careful, refilling water glasses with the same practiced invisibility Nora herself had once perfected out of necessity rather than choice. Nora watched her work the room, watched the way her eyes flicked toward the table whenever numbers were mentioned, the same instinctive attention Nora recognized because she had once worn it herself, and felt something complicated settle in her chest, equal parts recognition and an emotion she didn't entirely have a name for. Halfway through the meal, a dispute broke out over a supplier's invoice, voices climbing the same way they had climbed the night Nora first proved herself in this very room, and every head at the table turned, out of habit now, toward Nora rather than toward the waitress standing quietly near the wall. She settled the dispute in under a minute, the numbers falling into place in her mind the way they always did, and the room moved on without ceremony, the way rooms full of important men always moved on once a problem had been solved cleanly enough not to leave a mark. She caught the young waitress watching her afterward, the same wide, careful attention Nora herself had once aimed at men who never once suspected she was cataloging every flinch and stammer at their table, and for a brief moment, before the woman looked away and returned to her tray of empty glasses, something passed between them that neither of them said out loud. Nora thought, briefly, about saying something to her on the way out, some small piece of advice about which doors in this city were worth walking through and which ones were worth leaving closed. She decided against it. Everyone, she had learned, had to find their own $40 accusation, their own door propped open by a stranger's restaurant, before they understood anything true about which version of themselves they actually wanted to become. She left a generous tip in cash before she walked out, the kind of tip she had once dreamed about receiving on her worst nights at Harold's Diner, and did not look back. On a quiet evening in late spring, nearly a year after the night Harold had accused her of stealing $40 she had never touched, Nora sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, the city lights spreading out below her window in patterns she had long ago learned to read the way she read everything else, full of small inconsistencies that meant something to anyone patient enough to notice them. A new folder sat open on her desk, a discrepancy in a supplier's shipment that nobody else in the building had caught, the kind of small, careful lie that had once cost her a waitressing job and now, in this building, simply meant another quiet conversation in Edward's office, Another debt collected, another piece of leverage filed away for whenever it might prove useful. She did not think of herself as someone who had been saved exactly, nor as someone who had been ruined, though she understood that either word would have fit, depending on which version of her old life someone chose to compare this one against. She thought of herself, mostly, as someone who had finally found a place where the one thing she had always been, the quiet, relentless attention to detail nobody had ever wanted to pay her for, was no longer something she had to apologize for or hide. She closed the folder, turned off her desk lamp, and sat for a moment longer in the dark office, looking out at a city full of numbers she alone seemed able to see clearly, fully aware of exactly what she had become, and choosing, deliberately, the way she chose everything, to stay.